They say that history is like a river, always moving forward, present washing over past as it flows. In the northwest of the United States on the Columbia River, news reports began appearing in the early 1980s about an Indian poaching ring.
A 17-month undercover investigation culminated today in a raid by state and federal law enforcement.
On June 17, 1982, federal officials raided a place called Cook's Landing, Washington, and arrested the alleged ringleader, David Sohappy Sr.
David Sohappy Sr. is a leader of illicit commercial activity on the river.
In Los Angeles, David Sohappy Sr., who law enforcement officials call the leader of a massive poaching ring on the Columbia River, was found guilty of selling 317 salmon out of season. His son, David Jr., guilty of selling 27 fish. Both were sentenced to 5 years in federal prison.
The news reports focused on the latest conflict over fishing, but only hinted at the underlying collision of cultures. At the center of the reports, Sohappy remained strangely undefined. They barely mentioned that he was a religious leader of a traditional group of native fishermen who call themselves the River People. Here, 60 miles from Portland, it seemed there was a small eddy of the past. By the winter of 1987, Sohappy and his son had been in prison for just over a year. After suffering a stroke there, Sohappy was sometimes hard to understand. He seemed somehow lost.
You say I'm crazy, but the salmon, it has to be worshipped. Salmon only come back to the people that worships them. You got the federal laws, then you got international laws, then you got the constitutional laws, then you got the state laws, then you got the tribal laws that the Indians got to live with. A long time ago, the Indians had their own unwritten laws. They never broke it. To break it was to be the end of him. No more.
Officials claim that the defendants were part of a poaching ring.
I believe it's worth it going to prison, get this fishing issue settled one way or another. I believe we do have the right to live off that fish. We were here before anybody came around. We have trade and barter rights before anybody came around. They calling us squatters because we're living on Cook's Landings. Who are they to call anybody a squatter?
They've got to stop them, you know, teach them a lesson somehow.
I'm just waiting for David to be free. To me, I don't think supporting his family is wrong, the way he was taught by his ancestors. We have the right to sell the fish. We don't have jobs, sit behind a typewriter and sit on the boss's lap. No, we have to go out and fish. That's our life. It'll always be our life.
There are a few villages along both sides of the river where the Sohappy's beliefs are shared. It's a small community of just a few dozen families.
We're just traditional people living under our Creator the way we were created. And that's how we want to live in peace. We want to be able to go to the water and get our salmon like our Creator directs us through our songs.
David is a religious man. He believes in his old way, the traditional way. He believes in the 7 drums. He believes in the way he was taught by his father and his grandfather and him and his grandmother and him. The old people, they taught him from small. They taught him how to respect the land, to respect the water, to respect the river, to respect the food. Fish was one of them that he was to respect.
Mr. Sohappy was well known as a poacher, as was Cook's Landing well known as a hot spot of poaching. His views on his fishing rights are certainly extreme views. His view is that he is subject to no law of man anyway, on fishing, and that he can fish whenever and wherever he chooses. That is an extreme view. It's not a view that society can really tolerate.
David Sohappy is doing exactly what he was taught by his father and by his grandfather, and as they were taught by their grandfathers. His life revolves around the river, and his participation in his religion revolves around the use of the salmon for trading, for bartering, and for selling. All you need to do is go to Cook's Landing and look around and see the life that David and Myra lead down there. And any rational person would conclude that these are not greedy people.
The Sohappys were convicted of selling a total of 345 salmon, worth about $10,000 over the course of a year. Those sales supported an extended family of close to 20 people, including David and Myra Sohappy, their 5 children, and numerous grandchildren. It's been 25 years now that the Sohappys have lived here at Cook's Landing, fishing in open defiance of the state's laws. David and Myra met in a ceremonial longhouse on the Yakima Reservation when they were both about 5 years old. Their families, like many of the other river people, had been moved to the reservation. David and Myra were both raised in very strict traditional homes. David's grandparents only allowed him to stay in school until the 4th grade. They told him that the only thing the white man can teach you is how to read and how to write, because after that, he'll try to change your mind to his way of thinking.
We knew each other ever since little. We almost grew up together as neighbors. We used to live at the reservation, and my husband had a good job in the sawmill, and I worked in a cannery. And we was in debt. We owed a lot of money for our car and our rent. He got laid off. It was in the springtime, so we came over here. I know the white man says I'm breaking his laws, but what about my laws? The laws we got, unwritten laws. Our laws come from the Creator. That's the way we gotta live. Is it a crime to try to survive and eat in this country?
You say you gotta fish for yourself alone. Well, I'm not fishing for them, I'm fishing for myself. Then you say you can't do that, it's illegal. How can it be when it is legal for the Indians to do that all their lives?
Missionaries came to the Columbia in the middle of the 19th century. They brought the word of the gospel to a people decimated by disease, and later to the forts and stockades where many of the Indians were rounded up. But throughout the Northwest, there was a revival of old native beliefs. On the Columbia, this revival took the form of the Washat, or seven-drum religion. A Washat prophet, Smohala, taught his people that all wisdom comes in dreams. Smohala, who was David Sohappy's great-granduncle, dreamed that the future would bring destruction to the earth. Smohala told the river people that they must always remain along the river and continue fishing, because only those who follow the old ways would survive.
And the Indian belief is that people that go along with the Creator's way, they'll be saved. They all say that the land was given to them to keep it as long as they're on this earth, to honor it. A lot of those beliefs were handed down by the Creator to the people, like the drummers and dreamers. They used to have to be asleep first before they were given these instructions on what to do. Then they'd wake up and tell the people at the ceremony, here's what I dreamt, what we gotta do.
When the government sent an army officer to urge the river people to move to the reservation and take up farming, Smohala told him it was against nature. It is not a good law, he said, that would take my people away from me and make them sin against the laws of God. You ask me to plow the ground. Shall I take a knife and tear my mother's bosom? Then when I die, she will not take me to her bosom to rest. You ask me to dig for stone. Shall I dig under her skin for her bones? Then when I die, I cannot enter her body to be born again.
Mr. Sohappy's religion is if it is his religion, is a very convenient one, it seems to me, if it justifies this massive buying, brokering of illegal fish that he did. Now, you can keep in mind, please, we're not talking about Mr. Sohappy Sr. using a dip net to take fish out of the river to feed his family.
In the spring of 1981, we formed the operation that was aimed at the thieves that were stealing the public resource from the Columbia River. They were stealing from the Indians, they were stealing from the non-Indians, and they were stealing from the general public.
In the pre-dawn hours of June 17th, 1982, 13 carloads of heavily armed federal and state law enforcement officials, complete with air support, came in and burst into the Sohappy's house with guns drawn, searched the place, held children, locked them in a trailer for several hours. The federal government announced the raid with a press release blaming Sohappy for 40,000 missing fish that had been somehow disappeared above Bonneville Dam. This case was tried in the newspaper before it was ever tried in court.
Cook's Landing is one of 4 or 5 sites on the river that I think over the past about 10 or 15 years ago was taken over by a very small group of individuals who set up permanent residence there in the form of a shack, and that is prohibited by Bureau of Indian Affairs regulations.
In 1982, shortly before the massive raid on the Sohappy family camp, Wayne Lewis of the National Marine Fisheries Service wrote a letter to the Interior Department questioning the Sohappy's right to be there. And in 1983, shortly after David was found guilty, the Secretary of the Interior was urged to bring an eviction action. I think it is beyond dispute that the evictions are tied to the entire salmon scam prosecution. It's an effort to push the Sohappy family first out of the Columbia River and then off Cook's Landing.
I live here. No government is going to shove me off. If anybody's going to do away with me, it's going to be the nature, the Creator.
I'm living in 2 worlds, dividing my time. Unhappy in your world, and lonesome in mine.
50 miles from the Sohappy's home at Cook's Landing is the Yakima Reservation. For the people on the reservation, fishing as a full-time way of life has faded. The reservation was formed when the Indians of this area were forced to sign a treaty with the U.S. government in 1855, giving up 9 million acres of their land. One of the few things they retained was the right to hunt and fish at what the treaty called all their usual and accustomed places.
My grandfather and my great-grandfather went to the Walla Walla Treaty Grounds. They reserved these rights for us to fish, hunt, and gather, to live along a river, our land rights, to protect our cemeteries, and all the things that we have here that's valuable to the Indian people. After that treaty of 1855, they created these here reservations and made most of the people stay on them reservations. But the river people, they reserved this. They stayed here. They would not leave because they were fisher people. They were river people.
At one time, as many as 50,000 people lived along Chewana, the big river. To them it was a sacred place, unchanged for thousands of years. But when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, it brought those who saw the Columbia as the key to development in the Northwest. With the arrival of the canning process in the 1880s, the salmon became a valuable commodity. By 1890, 40 million pounds of salmon were being taken out of the river each year. But the power of the river really began to be harnessed in the 1930s with the construction of the first hydroelectric projects.
America's conquest of the Columbia has begun. An unshackled giant becomes a seaway to an empire. The promise of power for every corner of the Northwest. Power to uncover a treasure trove of idle resources, to turn them into useful goods for which a nation waits. Power for millions of Americans who look westward hopefully, for land and jobs, for security and happiness. Power to make the American dream come true.
By the middle of this century, one of the last traditional fishing villages left on the Columbia was Celilo.
When we lived on Columbia River way back in the 30s, my dad and my uncle used to make deep nets in Celilo. My dad used to tell me stories about the religion and all, tells of the beginning, things that happened to the earth as time went by.
Mi siya na ko pa siya charge ko pa sa mistanuch. Kana ko siya sa palay tanan ko ta jinji ta. Skisko ko ya na ya na pa 13 years old pa siya.
From what he could remember, he was about 13 years old when he first realized, you know, life around him. And in Celilo, during that time, there were many people there. There were a lot of elders. And they all lived there in that one place. And today, there's just him and few family members.
After they built the dams and they depleted our runs, the Indian people still had Celilo that was good. All that behind Celilo, the graveled rivers and the rough, cold water. The fish used to be so thick in there, they could practically walk on them. It was a great loss that when the Celilo Falls was flooded. The reason was so special is because all Indians fished on it. And they went out over this here rough, roaring water by cable cars. They built their scaffolds, their platforms on those rocks. People used to come from Europe and all over just to see the Indians and film them fishing out there. Today, that's all gone.
When Celilo Falls was blasted to make way for the Dallas Dam, the greatest native fishing ground in North America was destroyed. But on the hills around Celilo, there are still signs of an ancient world.
A story is told of the creation of Sun Man, who was to light up the sky always. But as time went by, the people forgot their ways, and the Creator hid Sun Man behind one of these hills and filled the world with cold. Eventually, a few elders remembered the sacred chants and sang them. The Creator relented and released the sun, but only during the day. He told the people they would still have salmon in the river and roots in the ground, but only if they took care to honor them. This would be their last warning. If they forgot their way again, they would be lost.
Salmon feast and powwow.
Nostalgically, it would be nice if the Indian peoples could fish whenever they wanted to and wherever they wanted to. I mean, we all kind of long for the good old days when there was plenty of everything. But one of the burdens of modern life is that there is not enough of anything to go around anymore. They simply have their share of the consequences of living in modern society.
I can point to you to at least 100 major causes of declines of the salmon runs on the Columbia River, and David Sohappy and Indian fishing would not make that list of the top 100.
Today, the Hanford nuclear reactor sits along the stretch of river where Smohalla used to live. No place in North America is more contaminated by nuclear waste than the land around Hanford. The reactor was built in the early 1940s to produce the plutonium used in the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When Hanford was built, David Sohappy's grandparents were among the people moved to the reservation.
Back in the 40s, the people that used to live on Hanford were driven off of land. They had land taken from them. My people had a village up there. They used to have sheds up there for curing salmon. And then in 1943, they moved all them people out of there, my people.
The government promised that they'd rebuild their homes, which they never have. All they done was built these here little like parkways for them to come and camp on, and then they made rules that they could only come there and camp and then leave and get out of there and go back to the reservation. Well, these Indians don't have nowhere to go, and they felt that that was they got tired of waiting in their homes, so we moved on to them little park areas. Now they claim that we don't belong on there. But where are our homes? Where are our villages? A lot of my people died waiting for them homes.
One of the sites the government built after the dams flooded the river people's homes was Cook's Landing. The Sohappys decided to move there permanently in the early 1960s. Ever since, they've been considered squatters on federal land. Moving back to the river was a small part of the fight for Indian treaty rights in the Northwest and of the growing civil rights movement in the 1960s.
The cause of the Indian in America, to me, is the number one cause confronting this country today. I hope that the Indians' attitude will not have to get as militant and as violent as the black people's attitude got before America would wake up and realize that it was a legitimate problem.
One of the first big revelations to me when I started investigating this case was to find out that this wasn't the first time David Sohappy had gotten in trouble for fishing illegally. In fact, back 20 years ago, in 1968, he'd been arrested, not too far from where he was arrested this time, on the Columbia River. And what's important about it is that he tried to get arrested. Sohappy was a civil rights activist, so to speak. Always fishing, always trying to test cases into court, to test his rights and to establish his rights and what he saw the rights of his people.
In the mid-60s, during the height of the civil rights movement, David Sohappy and a group of other Indians living along the Columbia River decided that they weren't going to get pushed any further, and they decided they were going to bring a case. David was thrown in jail in 1968, and he brought that landmark case in federal court, Sohappy v. Smith, that established that the state must prove a valid conservation reason for regulating Indian fishing. So David has been a thorn in the side of the state of Washington, at least since that decision.
The fight didn't end with Sohappy versus Smith. David continued fishing on the river, as did other fishermen. And in the 1970s, Another federal court decision came down. When the Bolt decision came out, it stated that Indian tribes would be allowed to catch 50% of the harvestable salmon. That decision was met with a lot of controversy within Washington and Oregon. It caught the attention of the non-Indian commercial fishermen. Their livelihood was suddenly jeopardized by a federal court ruling.
The Indians are being exalted and elevated to a position of supreme citizenship, with the other people in the state being relegated to a position of minority.
We're scratching for a handful of fish. It doesn't even pay for the expenses of the wear and tear that we're putting on our boats and gear. There's nobody that can operate like that, and it is not fair. I don't care who says it. Any man that comes up and tries to tell me or you or anybody else on the street that says that's fair and square because the Indians were here first, they are a goddamn liar.
The tensions focused on the Columbia River because it's there that the salmon runs begin and end. Each year, the young salmon go down the Columbia and out into the ocean. They swim thousands of miles in the ocean before attempting to return upriver to spawn and then die in the same streams they were born in.
Ocean fisheries were catching roughly 80% of all the salmon destined for the Columbia River. The fish that did make it back up the river had to go through dams, hydroelectric dams. It was very hard on the fish, and as a result, fewer and fewer fish were actually making it back to the spawning grounds.
Start killing off most of our fish. Then the fish start dwindling down. When the fish start dwindling down, well, they figured they had to have somebody to blame, so they had to blame the Indians. The Indians become the scapegoat.
In the early 1980s, the federal and state officials got together and they organized an undercover investigation. They went to Cook's Landing and they bought salmon from Indian fishermen.
One of the reasons advanced for starting the investigation was that there were 40,000 missing fish. The Fisheries Department had discovered that 40,000 salmon, which were supposed to return to their spawning grounds in the Columbia, were missing someplace, and of course the Indians were blamed.
It turned out a few years later that the fish were not missing. The fish simply spawned in unexpected areas because of fluorides in the river water. These fluorides came from aluminum mills along the river. Fish were there all the time, and yet the people who were caught and deemed as poachers responsible for this big loss went to trial anyway.
I don't think there's any question but what there's racism behind what happened to David Sohappy and his son and the other defendants in salmon scam. 5 years for 317 fish, and 5 years for 28 fish. Come on. It happened to Sohappy because he's inconvenient and because he's an Indian.
there's one person in this world that's still arguing. David is arguing. But David is getting tired being in prison so long for something that's ours to begin with. We gave up lots of acres to be left alone. What more does the government want?
A story is told of how Coyote found the salmon trapped behind a dam 5 Swallow sisters had built. Coyote freed the salmon, and in exchange they agreed to return each year to feed the people along the river.
Today, much along the river seems distant from the world of those old stories. Still, the river people continue to gather at traditional fishing villages like Sohappy to honor the salmon and to celebrate the gifts of the land.
We have feast on it to thank the Creator that He gave us abundance of salmon. We thank the Creator that there's water, salmon He sends, and the deer meat. Because someday this salmon and all this stuff is going to save our lives.
Sohappy, his son, and 3 other fishermen accused of salmon poaching on the Columbia River were acquitted by a 6-man tribal jury today. After a 2-week trial, jurors decided tribal fishing regulations infringed on the religious freedoms of the men to catch and use salmon. John Phillips has
As the verdicts were read by Judge David Ward,
While the ceremonies were going on at Sohappy, David Sohappy and the other Indian fishermen were found innocent in the Yakima tribal court. Pressure mounted on the federal government to release them.
The charges stem from the 1983 federal salmon scam sting operation.
A long, difficult road for David and his family, and we think it's time for the federal government to stand up and do the right thing and to let these people go back and resume their lives.
simple economic crime. There's much involved in the sovereignty of Indians, the question of tradition, religion, and custom. It also involves respect for the Indians. The first time I was made aware of the Sohappy case was when I read an article about Mr. Sohappy and his son. And then I got interested and asked the staff to provide me with more information. And the more I studied the case, the more it became obvious to me that something was wrong. It just smelled.
Senator Daniel Inouye has been sympathetically fighting to win David Sohappy's release at the Capitol, and by now he had hoped to meet the Yakima fisherman at his home on the Columbia River. But because of a ruling last week by a federal judge, this meeting took place in prison. The Sohappy case has been at the forefront of the Indian effort to preserve treaty rights.
If there's a violation of the law, there's a violation of the law, but apply the law equitably and fairly among Indians and non-Indians. In certain areas, it is not done. And in that area, in the state of Washington, unfortunately, the Sohappys had to serve 2 years in prison. And I suppose they would have stayed there longer if some of us did not intervene.
I'd like to thank all the supporters and all the people that prayed with us and even cried with us. I thank you. He came back so different. When he first came back, he was real absent-minded. He didn't know where things were. It seemed like he was still in the prison when he came back. He's slowly picking himself back up, but everything's so different now.
I was listening to my dad day after day, arguing, talking about fishing for over 20 years. He called my dad an outsider, a renegade. The old people said if you want to keep something, you have to argue for it. Even if there's one Indian still fishing, that's good.
The summer after the Sohappy's release, windsurfers were out in force on the Columbia. The stretch of river between Cook's Landing and Celilo had become known for the best windsurfing outside of Maui. Land prices were skyrocketing.
Progress. I mean, the way of progress. They just take. They never stop until it's all gone. Then they move to another country, take, until all their resources gone. Then where will they go?
One guy come down and says, David, you can only stay here temporarily. I says, I'm only here temporary to begin with. I'm not here forever. Nothing is.
That summer after their release, the Sohappys were appealing a federal decision to evict them. When the government tried to force Mohala off the river a little more than 100 years ago, he said that the river people had to remain there because someday all their dead would rise up again. We must wait here, he said, in the homes of our fathers, and be ready to meet them in the bosom of our mother. The Sohappys seemed as if they, too, were waiting for that day.
How much money would it take to locate a nuclear dump at Hanford?
Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we should not have humored him in that wanting to stay in that kind of primitive lifestyle.